Welcome everyone to our podcast today on why voluntary administrations might be suffering a slight identity crisis. So as we all know, the process of voluntary administration might have negative connotations. Is it time to start thinking about the administration process in a positive way? So today we're going to challenge some thought processes and think about how voluntary administration might be a useful tool in restructures. Times have changed. The process of restructuring in the landscape has really matured over the last 20 years. And we've all become a little bit more sophisticated in the way that we might think about it. So at Elvira, we look at things slightly differently. We try to look at things through a restructuring lens. Today I'm joined by my fellow principals from Elvira, Raj Goyal, Tony Wright and Neil Cussen. So welcome. Let's start with you, Raj. What do you think has changed in terms of the way we look at VAs in recent times compared to how we may have looked at VAs in the past?
Thanks, Kate. For many, VA means high-profile collapses, and media language such as administrators called in has done little to shift that mindset. However, sophisticated stakeholders have moved past that notion. In reality, VA is an effective formal legal restructuring tool when used correctly with the right advisors and time right. Companies emerge a lot stronger. In my mind, VA is proactive crisis management, not surrender, not giving up. That's how we need to look at it, with a positive mindset. So at its core, VA aims to provide breathing space from credit pressure. It allows an independent party to go in, and the end goal is to deliver a binding restructuring plan. It's called a deal of company arrangement. That's the end goal. That's where we want to get to. In my view, the deal of company arrangement needs to be considered even before the company goes in VA. Pre-appointment planning is critical to ensure a smooth transition into VA. If this is done right, it usually reduces the number of issues encountered during the VA.
I think the education piece around like stakeholder management, particularly like an employee group who have only heard bad stories about insolvency. We get appointed, they read the press who are using words like collapse, which is really not true. So I think the key thing to manage those expectations is to give those key stakeholders who are critical for the business continuing to operate into the future, giving them the level of comfort they need to turn up to work every day. So I think there's a bit of it's an education piece, and I think there's a lot of positive communication, by us and by, I would hope the media to help us educate your mums and dads, your general creditor group who really don't understand the difference between a receivership, a voluntary administration, a liquidation. They don't understand.
I think that's right, and the VA is meant to be a process in which allows a company to survive into the future, and you think about the way that you can use a VA to effectively clean up a balance sheet and start a fresh line in the sand and move forward without the heavy burden of debt. And just changing the framework about how we might talk about that in a VA process and the opportunity that it perhaps presents in certain cases, not all, to start afresh and relieve the directors and the company of the extraordinary stress that they must be faced with unable to repay that debt. And I guess that's really the fundamental basic opportunity that a VA presents. And it does have negative connotations. Measuring it against the alternative is at least a chance of success.
Well, it's the uncertainty, isn't it? We walk in as an independent party to operate a business, the directors step aside. It is scary for employees. There is uncertainty there, but it's our job to manage that uncertainty.
In the context of not dealing with the current problem and jumping off the cliff is a better proposition than staying in the environment of debt that the company's got itself into. And that can happen for a whole bunch of reasons, of which no one is to blame sometimes. Environmental factors in many cases. So it's really about just cleaning up the balance sheet and moving forward.
I agree, Kate. Resetting the balance sheet is what the VA process is really about. A lot of times we become administrators and usually it's a very good underlying business. How do we protect that business? I use Procure, a matter that I worked on last year, as a prime example. It was a B2B lending business. It had a very good underlying business. It was a startup. It was about the fourth into it. It was just burdened with too much secured debt. Pre-appointment, They'll try to renegotiate with the secured creditor to reduce the debt. Wasn't facilitating that. It went through the VA process to do a deal, effectively refinance through the VA process. The benefit of the VA process was it brought it all to a head, defined timeline when a deal had to get done. My role as administrator was to explain to everyone, particularly the secured creditor, this is a good deal, this is in your benefit as well. Through the VA process, the secured debt was reduced to a manageable level. The company was returned to its director. The debt was serviced. The company is now growing. So it's a good example of resetting the balance sheet to the right amount to allow the business to be successful.
Sometimes it needs that independent administrator to step in and take the emotion out of the situation and have genuine, informative conversations with stakeholders to draw their attention to the benefits of following the path of administration to an outcome. And some of those benefits for creditors could be, the continued customer for many, many years and the profit that they will make into the future rather than losing a customer. It might be a loss in one point of time to lose, a certain amount of money that's owed at that time. But the opportunity to continue to trade and generate profits from that customer over a period of time may well outweigh the detriment of, supporting it and taking the emotion out of the behaviours and making sure that stakeholders understand clear benefits. And that's a part of the administration process and the independence that I guess an administrator brings to the role.
Yeah, I think when you look back some time ago when VAs came into our working lives, it was to replace liquidation, was enabling directors to put their hand up early and say, hey, I want to preserve this business. I want to maximise the chance of recovering value for not just the creditors but also the stakeholders. So it's a really important process for stakeholders. And the VA process allowed that flexibility for administrators independently to come in and help put a plan together, move to that DOCA if that's what was coming, or even preserve the business whilst cash flows righted, and then the administration could end. We had quite a large defence matter where all the company needed was time, and the VA process gave 3 months to enable an infusion of new energy and funding to keep the business going, and creditors and stakeholders alike got a wonderful return rather than an immediate winding up, which would have just been a death knell for everyone. But VA is an important process. It replaced liquidations and schemes of arrangement as an important tool now for all directors to get a second chance. So I think the VA process shouldn't be looked as a myth, whilst it's a difficult process, it's not one that needs to be an overburden. I think it's reaching out for help, moving things along and getting a better outcome.
I think a good example too, one you and I did, Neil, recently. A company might have 5 contracts, one's not profitable. So the VA process allows us to go in there to kill off or cut off the unprofitable contract and effectively return the business to profitability.
Get rid of the gangarous arm.
Get rid of the gangarous arm.
And no, we should really not underestimate the value of that moratorium that's created through the VA process and the ability to terminate unprofitable contracts and arrangements.
One of the great tools in a VA is in preserving the businesses, to keep not just suppliers intact, but employees, keeping their jobs, retaining key employees that have the knowledge to keep the business going forward, keep the reputational issues of the business and the branding, which has so much value, intact, and moving that forward to allow creditors to vote on an outcome that gives them a better opportunity to continue to trade with the business than an immediate liquidation. So I think that's an important part of that VA process.
I think that's, a liquidation is death, the company will die, versus a voluntary administration, which is all about a restructure and a second chance. That's the key differences.
I suppose for directors and boards, one of the key fears they may have around engaging with the voluntary administration process is that creditors will ultimately not accept the deal or proposal and the company will be forced to go into liquidation. And that entire process is then taken out of the hands of the directors or the board. And I suppose to allay that fear in some ways, and yes, it is a big cliff to jump off, control is ultimately lost by the board or the directors. However, in our experience and my experience, what I could say is that the reality is that in most cases, stakeholders, being the creditors, ultimately commercially driven, and whatever deal they support is going to be a deal that is a better outcome than the alternative, which is that the company goes into liquidation. So most creditors, once we cut through all the emotional issues want the company to survive and to continue to trade, and because they benefit from the continued trading by engaging in trade with them and continuing to earn profits. They also want to get the highest dividend that they can, or the highest return. And if a deed is proposed where it's a better return, then the chances are that they're going to get a better return under a deed. And mostly the creditors will trust a good administrator's and a good independent administrator's recommendations and what those recommendations are. So in our experience, some of that fear that directors might have in engaging with administrations can be really allayed by that commercial sense or that behaviour by stakeholders and creditors.
Yeah, so VA, is it suitable for any size company? Look, the simple answer to that question is yes. Big companies, listed companies can do the voluntary administration process, but, the smaller companies can go through the process. We help a lot of companies where there's just a small group of creditors, a handful of employees. We can enter into the process. There might be a big ATO debt, for example. We can get in there while we work with the director group to put forward what might be a deed of company arrangement proposal, and subject to our assessment would likely be in the best interest of creditors. VA can be done for any size company. And again, as we've probably mentioned already, the key objective is to save the small business, to keep employees in a job, to preserve value, and importantly, relationships.
Tony, I agree with that. The VA process has been designed to be a quick process. Directors do a resolution, you go in VA straight away. There's no court involvement. Costs can be kept down. Particularly with the trade-on matter, there's ways you can sort of minimise the cost. If you have faith in the existing management team, you can rely on them to continue trade on the business and have oversight over them. You can enter into license agreements. There's ways to keep costs down, because cost is a big factor for smaller companies. So I agree, the VA is designed for all types of companies and sizes.
We did a real estate agency last year. It had a big ATO debt. The director, put his head in the sand. We didn't really appreciate the complexity or the seriousness of the wind-up application by the ATO. So once he got the right advice from a lawyer, he immediately put it into VA, and we worked through the process of, that moratorium period, that breathing space that the VA allows small business to have whilst that independent administrator comes in to do an assessment. And ultimately, he found the money. It meant the wind-up process came to a halt with the consent of the petitioning creditor, and the administration ultimately ended, but he needed to run that process. The company would have entered liquidation through the court system. Many different ways or different scenarios where the VA process works.
And in that case, Tony, remind me, did the creditors get paid out 100 cents in the dollar?
100 cents in the dollar.
Yeah, that's impressive.
100 cents in the dollar. And it was a timing issue, really. Like I said, the director put his head in the sand. I think that was the biggest issue here. Moving forward, it's a good business and it should survive.
VA process also has the flexibility to flip into something that could perhaps be used for the larger corporate. There are ways that you can extend the timeframes with court intervention, but that's a story for another day. But it does have a significant amount of flexibility, and even in the deals that you do with creditors, there is no bounds on that flexibility other than being able to deal with the equity holders. In some circumstances, you can tinker with that as well. So it's the flexibility and the ability to come up with creative solutions to sometimes complex problems is really attractive in some cases too, and it allows companies to continue on to the future solving very complex problems with mechanism.
One thing I like about the VA process, it's very defined. It's a process prescribed under the Corporations Act, but there's flexibility within that process. For medium-large companies, it takes longer to do the investigations. You usually run a sale process, recapitalisation process. It's very common to extend that VA moratorium period. It's very common to extend the VA process, which usually goes 5 weeks. You can either do it by court process or by credit resolution. The VA process is very accommodating just to suit the business or the company that you're undertaking. That's one of the benefits, I think, with the VA process. You can do...
Yeah, I think that's right, Raj. Certainly in my experience, no one company is, we're never presented with the same problems. Similar, but never the same. So every administration process that I've ever done, there's nuances and challenges and problems and complexities that are quite unique to that one company. So that flexibility is key to the success of it, and I think that's why it's been so successful over the years, and it's able to adapt even to the environment that we're working in. As we, definitely the cultural environment of our corporate Australia is very much swaying towards restructures as opposed to liquidations. Over my career, that has definitely been a propensity to try and work problems out. It's a better outcome for everyone And the VA process is adapting to that as well, and that corporate culture that we're driving towards. We're moving away from the punitive insolvency regime that we've been encompassed in previous, I suppose, legislation. We see Safe Harbour is also moving towards trying to get directors to deal with issues so that things can be restructured either through a VA or some other process quicker. So I think, the corporate Australia is definitely changing. The cultural corporate Australia is changing. And the VA seems to be able to adapt to that changing culture just by its pure flexibility.
That's right, particularly with the international headwinds, the complexities that are now blowtorched on our economy. The flexibility within the VA regime allows administrators to deal with that international complexity that probably wasn't first thought out back in the 1990s when it came in. So that's a really good adaptation of the VA process now.
The media just have to stop using words like collapse, put that positive spin.
Yeah, I think collapse should be reserved for liquidation and
Absolutely.
bankruptcy. VA is not a collapse. It's a restructure. And
It's to give a viable business a second chance.
I'd like to encourage listeners to download our guide, Navigating Voluntary Administrations. It outlines the VA process, the timeline, and key factors to consider. It's useful for directors or advisors advising boards. You can download the VA guide from the QR code on the screen.
Well, thanks, Tony, Raj and Neil. That was a really interesting conversation about how VAs are changing and how they can be used as an opportunity for a second chance for many companies. And really the driver of success of a VA is about making sure that we get the timing right, having that independence and the transparency. The other key aspect is really making sure that the administrator that you select, whoever that may be, is trustworthy. And I think that's key. There needs to be obviously a willingness of directors to engage in the process. And I would think that an administrator, whoever is ever selected, one of the key strengths has to be around communication. Communication is key. It's about informing stakeholders of the relevant information and framing the process in a positive and hopeful way. So it really is designed to give company directors and boards the time and space to develop a workable plan for all stakeholders to find a better way forward. Well, thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.